Mobutu Sese Seko ruled Zaire, now the Democratic Republic of the Congo, from 1965 to 1997, as an autocratic leader who maintained a strict and oppressive regime. Rising to power through a coup d'état in 1965, Mobutu established a single-party state, declaring himself the sole authority and outlawing political opposition. He implemented a policy of authenticity, which aimed to rid the country of colonial influences, including renaming the nation to Zaire and mandating African names for its citizens. Mobutu's reign was characterized by widespread corruption, human rights abuses, and the systematic exploitation of the country's vast natural resources to amass personal wealth, while the population endured extreme poverty. He controlled the media, suppressed dissent with a brutal security apparatus, and developed a cult of personality, portraying himself as the nation's father. Despite his oppressive rule, he enjoyed support from Western nations during the Cold War due to his anti-communist stance. Mobutu's regime crumbled in 1997 after years of economic decline and rebellion, leading to his overthrow by Laurent Désiré Kabila, marking the end of one of Africa's most infamous dictatorships. Augusto Pinochet was a military dictator who ruled Chile from 1973 to 1990. He came to power through a coup d'état on September 11, 1973, overthrowing the democratically elected government of President Salvador Allende. Pinochet's regime was marked by strict authoritarian control, widespread human rights abuses, and the suppression of political opposition. Thousands of people were arrested, tortured, or disappeared under his rule as he sought to eliminate leftist influence in the country, dissolved the Chilean Congress, banned political parties, and imposed strict censorship. His government implemented neoliberal economic reforms that privatized industries and reduced state control, which were praised by some for stabilizing the economy, but criticized for deepening inequality. Despite holding a tightly controlled referendum in 1988, which led to his eventual departure from power in 1990, Pinochet remained a controversial figure, with ongoing debates about his legacy and accountability for crimes committed during his rule. Robert Mugabe was a prominent figure in African politics, serving as the leader of Zimbabwe from 1980 to 2017. Initially celebrated as a liberation hero who played a key role in ending white minority rule and achieving independence for Zimbabwe. In 1980, Mugabe's leadership soon took on a deeply authoritarian character. As prime minister and later as president, he consolidated power by systematically eliminating political opposition through intimidation, imprisonment, and violence. His regime was marked by the suppression of dissent, a disregard for human rights, and a reliance on patronage to maintain control. Mugabe's government became infamous for its ruthless actions against opposition parties, particularly the Matabeleland massacres of the mid-1980s, where thousands of civilians were killed during military operations against suspected dissidents. Under his leadership, elections were frequently marred by violence, vote rigging, and coercion, ensuring his dominance in power. In the early 2000s, his controversial land reform policies, which involved seizing white-owned farms and redistributing them, led to widespread economic collapse, hyperinflation, and food shortages. These actions, although presented as a means to correct colonial injustices, were often carried out in ways that benefited Mugabe's loyalists rather than the broader population. Mugabe's rule, which lasted nearly 4 decades, was characterized by his determination to cling to power at all costs. His policies and leadership style turned Zimbabwe from a promising and prosperous nation into one of economic decline and political instability. Despite widespread domestic and international condemnation, Mugabe remained defiant until he was ousted in 2017 through a military intervention, marking the end of one of Africa's most enduring and autocratic regimes. His legacy remains deeply divisive, symbolizing both the fight for liberation and the dangers of unchecked power. Muammar Gaddafi. He ruled Libya from 1969 to 2011, was one of the most infamous and authoritarian leaders in modern history. Rising to power through a military coup that overthrew King Idris, Gaddafi quickly established a regime rooted in personal control, repression, and propaganda. He declared Libya a socialist state governed by his ideological manifesto, the Green Book, which blended Islamic and socialist principles while rejecting democracy and capitalism. Political parties were banned, and dissent was ruthlessly crushed through imprisonment, torture, and executions. Gaddafi created a surveillance state, where fear and loyalty to his rule were enforced by secret police and revolutionary committees. Under his rule, Libya became known for its human rights abuses, including mass detentions and the execution of political opponents, often in public to instill terror. Gaddafi's grip extended beyond Libya, as he supported international terrorism, funding groups such as the Irish Republican Army and orchestrating the bombing of Pan Am Flight 103 over Lockerbie, Scotland in 1988. His rule also amassed immense personal wealth, while much of the population lived in poverty, despite Libya's significant oil reserves. Gaddafi cultivated a bizarre personality cult, portraying himself as the brother leader and guide of the revolution, living lavishly while claiming to be a champion of the oppressed. His speeches were often erratic, and he demanded unwavering adulation from his citizens. The Arab Spring uprisings in 2011 marked the downfall of his regime. As Libyans revolted against decades of repression, Gaddafi responded with brutal force, killing thousands of civilians. His refusal to relinquish power ultimately led to his capture and death at the hands of rebels in October 2011, ending a 42-year dictatorship that left Libya fractured and struggling to recover. Ferdinand Marcos was the president of the Philippines from 1965 to 1986 and is widely regarded as one of the most authoritarian leaders in the country's history. His rule began under the guise of democratic leadership, but soon transformed into a dictatorship when he declared martial law in 1972. This move allowed him to consolidate power, suppress political dissent, and extend his presidency beyond constitutional limits. Under martial law, Marcos wielded near-absolute control over the government, silenced opposition, and curtailed civil liberties. Political opponents were arrested, media outlets were shut down or censored, and the military was used to enforce his rule. Marcos justified his authoritarian measures by claiming they were necessary to combat rising communist insurgency and economic instability. However, his regime became synonymous with corruption, nepotism, and human rights abuses. His wife, Imelda Marcos, became infamous for her lavish lifestyle, which symbolized the couple's plundering of the nation's wealth. It is estimated that the Marcos family and their cronies embezzled billions of dollars during his tenure. Despite his promises of economic progress, the country suffered under crippling debt and economic mismanagement. Public dissent grew as human rights violations, including torture and extrajudicial killings, became widespread. The assassination of opposition leader Benigno Aquino Jr. in 1983 galvanized public outrage, leading to the eventual People Power Revolution in 1986. This peaceful uprising forced Marcos and his family to flee to Hawaii, marking the end of his two-decade rule. His legacy remains deeply controversial, characterized by his centralization of power, extravagant corruption, and the suffering of countless Filipinos under his regime. Bashar Al Assad, born on September 11, 1965, has been the president of Syria since July 17, 2000. He inherited power following the death of his father, Hafez al-Assad, who ruled Syria for nearly 3 decades. Initially seen as a potential reformer, Bashar's rule quickly became characterized by authoritarianism and a centralized grip on power. His government is known for its brutal suppression of dissent, media censorship, and widespread human rights violations. The Assad regime faced significant challenges beginning in 2011 when peaceful protests erupted as part of the Arab Spring. These demonstrations, which called for democratic reforms, were met with violent crackdowns, leading to a protracted and devastating civil war. The conflict has resulted in hundreds of thousands of deaths, widespread displacement, and immense destruction across Syria. Assad's forces have been accused of war crimes, including the use of chemical weapons against civilians, indiscriminate bombings, and systematic torture in detention centers. Bashar al-Assad has maintained power through the support of key allies, including Russia and Iran, which have provided military and economic assistance. His leadership has been marked by a ruthless determination to crush opposition, consolidate authority, and retain control of the Syrian state at any cost. Despite international condemnation and sanctions, Assad has shown little willingness to compromise, making him one of the most controversial and strict leaders of the modern era. Saddam Hussein, who ruled Iraq from 1979 to 2003, was one of the most notorious and wicked dictators in modern history. His regime was marked by extreme brutality and totalitarian control over every aspect of Iraqi life. Hussein came to power through violent means, eliminating rivals and consolidating authority by silencing political opposition. His reign was characterized by widespread human rights abuses, including the use of chemical weapons against both military targets and civilian populations. The most infamous example of this was the 1988 Halabja massacre, where thousands of Kurdish civilians were killed with chemical agents. Hussein's iron grip on power was maintained through fear and repression. He employed a vast network of secret police and intelligence agencies to monitor, arrest, and execute anyone suspected of opposing his rule. His regime was notorious for its use of torture, forced disappearances, and public executions as a means of instilling terror among the population. His leadership was also marked by a personality cult, where he presented himself as a godlike figure to the Iraqi people, manipulating propaganda to maintain his image as the savior of the nation. Internationally, Saddam Hussein's aggressive actions and disregard for human life extended beyond Iraq's borders. He invaded Iran in 1980, starting the brutal Iran-Iraq War, which lasted for 8 years and resulted in the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people. In 1990, he invaded Kuwait, prompting a military intervention by the United States and its allies during the Gulf War. Despite these atrocities, Hussein clung to power for decades, refusing to yield to international pressure or internal dissent. His reign only ended in 2003, when the United States invaded Iraq, leading to his eventual capture and trial. Saddam Hussein's dictatorship was a period of extreme cruelty, where his personal desires for power and revenge drove him to commit unspeakable atrocities, making him one of the most ruthless and wicked leaders of the 20th century. Franco, who ruled Spain from 1939 to 1975, stands out as one of the most strict and enduring dictators of the 20th century. After leading a military rebellion that culminated in the Spanish Civil War, 1936 to 1939, Franco established a fascist regime that imposed absolute control over the nation for decades. His rule was marked by the suppression of all political opposition, the banning of trade unions, and the execution or imprisonment of thousands of dissenters. Franco centralized power in himself, maintained strict censorship, and enforced rigid cultural and religious conformity, promoting conservative Catholic values while eradicating regional identities such as Catalan and Basque cultures. His government used fear, propaganda, and a powerful secret police network to control the population. Franco's authoritarian legacy deeply shaped modern Spain, with his strict regime leaving a lasting imprint on the country's political and social fabric. His rule only ended with his death in 1975, after which Spain transitioned to democracy. Idi Amin, who ruled Uganda from 1971 to 1979, is widely regarded as one of the most ruthless and strict dictators in modern history. His regime was marked by brutal repression, widespread human rights abuses, and a complete disregard for democratic principles. Upon seizing power in a military coup, Amin quickly consolidated his authority by purging the military and government of anyone he perceived as a threat, often through mass executions. He expelled over 70,000 Asians, primarily of Indian descent, from Uganda in 1972, seizing their businesses and properties, which led to economic collapse. Amin's rule was characterized by paranoia, erratic decision-making, and a cult of personality. It is estimated that his regime was responsible for the deaths of 300,000 to 500,000 people, many of whom were tortured and killed in extrajudicial executions. He suppressed political dissent with an iron fist, using his secret police to instill fear among the population. Despite his brutal reign, Amin showed little concern for the well-being of his citizens, focusing instead on lavish personal indulgences and maintaining his grip on power. His rule came to an end in 1979 when Ugandan exiles and Tanzanian forces invaded, forcing him into exile. Idi Amin's legacy remains one of cruelty, terror, and strict authoritarianism. Pol Pot, who led Cambodia from 1975 to 1979, stands out as one of the most extreme and strict dictators in modern history. As the head of the Khmer Rouge, his vision of creating an agrarian communist utopia drove him to enforce policies that were not only draconian but devastatingly lethal. Pol Pot's regime abolished money, private property, religion, and urban living, forcing millions of Cambodians into labor camps and rural communes. Intellectuals, professionals, and even those who wore glasses were targeted as enemies of the state, often executed without trial. His policies led to famine, disease, and outright extermination, causing the deaths of approximately 2 million people, about a quarter of Cambodia's population at the time. Pol Pot's strict control extended to every aspect of life, enforcing a culture of fear and obedience underpinned by mass surveillance and brutality. His rule remains one of the most notorious examples of dictatorship and human suffering in history. Benito Mussolini, who ruled Italy from 1922 to 1943, is remembered as one of the most notorious dictators in history. As the founder of fascism, Mussolini established a totalitarian regime that sought to control nearly every aspect of Italian life. He dismantled democratic institutions, suppressed political opposition, and used propaganda to glorify his leadership. Mussolini's regime was marked by severe censorship, secret police, and the elimination of dissent through imprisonment, exile, and even assassination. He aimed to create a militarized, imperialist Italy, and his expansionist ambitions led to brutal colonial campaigns in Africa, particularly in Ethiopia, where atrocities against civilians were widespread. Mussolini's alliance with Adolf Hitler during World War II further cemented his role in one of the darkest periods of modern history, as Italy became a key member of the Axis powers. His rule ultimately ended in failure, with Italy suffering devastation during the war and Mussolini himself being captured and executed by Italian partisans in 1945. His legacy is a grim reminder of the dangers of unchecked authoritarianism and the destructive impact of extreme nationalist ideology. Kim Jong-un, born in 1984, has ruled North Korea since 2011, continuing the totalitarian dynasty established by his grandfather, Kim Il-sung, and his father, Kim Jong-il. His regime is marked by absolute control over every aspect of North Korean life, maintaining power through fear, propaganda, and strict suppression of dissent. Under Kim Jong-un's leadership, the country has expanded its nuclear weapons program, defying international sanctions and increasing global tensions. The government enforces a brutal system of punishment, including public executions, forced labor camps, and collective punishment for entire families of perceived dissidents. Citizens have no freedom of expression, press, or movement, and a pervasive cult of personality glorifies Kim as an almost divine figure. His leadership style is characterized by extreme isolationism, keeping the country cut off from most of the world while ensuring the loyalty of the elite through a combination of rewards and fear. Kim Jong-un's rule is one of the most repressive and tightly controlled in modern history, making him one of the most notorious dictators on the list. Mao Zedong, the founding father of the People's Republic of China from 1949 to 1976, was one of history's most authoritarian leaders, whose strict policies and governance transformed China but also brought immense suffering. He centralized power, creating a cult of personality where dissent was harshly punished. His strictness was epitomized in massive campaigns like the Great Leap Forward from 1958 to 1962, an economic initiative aiming to industrialize China rapidly, which led to widespread famine and the deaths of an estimated 30 to 45 million people. Similarly, the Cultural Revolution from 1966 to 1976 sought to eliminate bourgeois elements and enforce communist ideology, resulting in chaos, purges, and millions of deaths or displacements. Mao's unwavering control over the Communist Party ensured no tolerance for opposition, cementing his legacy as a transformative yet repressive dictator who prioritized ideological purity and personal power over human lives. Joseph Stalin, leader of the Soviet Union from 1924 until his death in 1953, is widely regarded as one of history's most ruthless dictators. His rule was characterized by strict control over every aspect of Soviet life, enforced through widespread fear, propaganda, and repression. Stalin consolidated power by eliminating rivals, including Leon Trotsky, and established a cult of personality that portrayed him as an infallible leader. He presided over the Great Purge, a campaign of political repression in which millions of people were executed, imprisoned, or sent to labor camps. Stalin's policies, such as forced collectivization of agriculture, led to devastating famines, including the Holodomor in Ukraine, which caused the deaths of millions. Despite industrializing the Soviet Union and strengthening its military, his five-year plans often prioritized production quotas over human welfare, resulting in widespread suffering. Through strict censorship and surveillance, Stalin suppressed dissent, controlled the media, and manipulated history to serve his regime's narrative. His leadership style and policies created a climate of fear and oppression that defined Soviet life, leaving a legacy of both industrial progress and profound human tragedy. Adolf Hitler, as the leader of Nazi Germany from 1933 to 1945, exemplified one of history's most notorious dictators. He established a totalitarian regime, consolidating all political power under his control after dismantling democratic institutions through measures like the Enabling Act. Hitler imposed strict censorship, abolished political opposition, and instilled a pervasive climate of fear through the Gestapo and SS. His ideology, centered around Aryan supremacy and anti-Semitism, led to the Holocaust, the systematic extermination of 6 million Jews and millions of other perceived undesirables. Under his strict rule, Germany pursued aggressive militarization, propaganda-driven nationalism, and territorial expansion, plunging the world into World War II. His rigid enforcement of policies, intolerance for dissent, and reliance on terror as a governing tool cement his legacy as a ruthless and authoritarian leader. I know you were expecting more video like this. So, hit the thumbs up button and subscribe to the channel. Your support means the world, and it helps me bringing you more content.